When 16-year-old Marcus faced humiliating injustice at the park, a single moment turned his peaceful day upside down. Officer Daniel King, confident in his authority and unaware of the consequences, crossed the line in front of everyone. But fate had a surprise in store. The new police chief was Marcus's father. Get ready for a gripping story where karma catches up and justice finally finds its voice. The late afternoon sun hung low above the old elms, casting golden light over the small community park in East Memphis. The air shimmered, heavy with warmth and the scent of freshly cut grass. Beyond the fence, cicadas sang their endless song, and somewhere down the block, a radio played softly through an open window. The park was a modest one. 2 basketball hoops, a weathered bench, and cracked asphalt that told stories of years long gone. It was a familiar place for many kids from the neighborhood, but for Marcus Hill, 16, it was more than that. This was his space, his refuge. Every day after school, after helping his mom with errands or watching his little sister, Marcus came here to play until the sky turned violet and the lights buzzed on. He wasn't the loudest or the biggest, but he had grace. Every motion was smooth, practiced, almost rhythmic. The ball seemed to flow with him rather than follow, arcing through the air with perfect precision before gliding through the hoop. His friends cheered as the sound echoed through the still air. For Marcus, those moments were peace. Laughter spilled across the park, cutting through the slow hum of the evening. His friends, Jamal, Trevor, and Quinn, played alongside him, teasing, shouting, running barefoot across the warmed pavement. It was a scene anyone passing by would recognize. Young people, free and full of energy, chasing seconds of joy before the night settled in. But down the street, an engine sounded, low, mechanical, the kind of sound that changed the tone of a place without warning. A black and white patrol car turned the corner and slowed as it approached the park entrance. Every sound, the laughter, the bouncing ball, even the cicadas, seemed to hush. The car stopped. The door opened with a heavy click. Officer Daniel King stepped out. He was a tall man, built solid, early 40s, his uniform crisp despite the heat. His mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, but his posture spoke louder than words. Rigidity born of habit, authority carried like a second skin. King was new to the neighborhood, newly transferred after serving years in a more urban district. He was used to order, to control, to being listened to the first time he spoke. He looked across the court. 4 teenagers, nothing unusual. But the sound, the laughter, the movement, it made him pause. Somewhere in his mind, habit sparked suspicion where there was none. He adjusted his belt and began walking toward them. The crunch of his boots on gravel made Marcus look up. Their eyes met briefly. One calm, one measuring. The game quieted. The ball rolled lazily to a stop near the free-throw line. Jamal stepped back, whispering, maybe we should go." Marcus frowned slightly. "For what?" "We're not doing anything." King's tone came flat and official. "Evening. You boys got permission to use this park today?" Marcus blinked. "Permission? This is a public park, sir. We just—" The officer raised a hand. "Answer the question directly." The words hung there, cold and sharp. The friends exchanged uncertain glances. Marcus, who'd been raised to stay calm and respectful, nodded slowly. "No, sir. But we come here every day. We're not making trouble." King's lips pressed into a thin line. "We've had reports of disturbance, noise complaints, groups hanging around too long." Trevor mumbled, "We've only been here an hour." The officer's gaze snapped toward him. "Watch your tone." Marcus folded his arms, grounding himself. "Sir, we're just trying to play. You can ask anyone around here. We're not hurting anybody." His voice was polite but steady, almost too steady. It wasn't defiance, it was composure. But to a man like King, composure from a teenager felt like resistance. There was a moment, silent, stifling, when neither moved. The sun slipped behind the trees, shadows lengthening across the pavement. The tension thickened with each passing second, an invisible thread pulling tighter between them. King took a step closer. He didn't fully understand why his pulse had quickened. Something about this boy's steady calm, the lack of fear, the quiet assurance, unsettled him. He felt the old instinct to establish control, to reassert the hierarchy he'd built his entire identity around. "I said this area's under watch," he repeated, his tone colder now. "You boys need to clear out." The friends hesitated. Quinn took a step back, but Marcus just said quietly, "Yes, sir. We'll finish this round and go." A flicker crossed King's face, irritation, disbelief, something darker, before he exhaled sharply. "No, you'll go now." The command was final, the air suddenly electric. The kids looked to Marcus. He nodded slowly, trying to keep peace, and took a step toward the bench to grab his bag. But at the same time, King moved too, convinced the boy was ignoring him. They nearly collided, a second of confusion and tension colliding like sparks. Both froze. For a heartbeat you could almost hear time stop. Marcus lifted his hands slightly, palms open. "Sir, I was just getting—" "Enough," King snapped. His own tone startled even him. Too loud, too sharp. The nearby chatter from park-goers ceased completely. The cicadas stopped their rhythm. The heat felt unbearable now. Marcus's friends stood in silence, hearts pounding, unsure whether to speak or move. The moment passed. Then, quietly, breathlessly, the power shifted, not through action, but through fear. King adjusted his belt, muttered something under his breath, and turned away. "Clear the park," he said again, his voice low and firm. Minutes later the squad car rolled out, tires crunching over gravel. Dust hung in the sunlight lingering between the trees. Marcus sat alone on the bench, staring at the basketball that lay still in the middle of the court. His reflection shimmered faintly in the polished surface. His friends hovered by the sidewalk, silent, uncertain. He said nothing. He didn't shout, didn't curse, just sat there, feeling something unfamiliar, not fear, not anger, but a tightness in the chest that came when your dignity brushed against the edge of something unjust. The sky deepened into burnt orange. Marcus finally stood, his movements slow, deliberate. He picked up the basketball and whispered to himself words no one heard. Then, with a single smooth motion, he threw the ball high. It sailed perfectly, cutting through the air like a promise, landing clean in the hoop. The sound echoed, sharp and hollow, across the quiet park. Evening crept slowly over the neighborhood, painting the sky in a wash of amber, fading to deep blue. Streetlights flickered awake, one by one, while the world settled into its quiet nighttime rhythm. But in the Hill household, quiet was nowhere to be found. The house felt too still, too heavy with the echo of what had happened earlier that day. Marcus sat at the dining table, spinning his basketball between his palms. His mother, Layla, watched him from the stove, stirring a pot that had long since stopped boiling. The air between them carried an unspoken weight. "What happened today at the park?" she finally asked, her voice soft but trembling at the edge. Marcus hesitated. He didn't want to tell her everything, not because he was afraid, but because he hated how her eyes dimmed every time something like this reached their doorstep. "It was nothing," he said. "Just a misunderstanding." Her stirring stopped. "Marcus, you don't flinch like that for a misunderstanding." He looked down, his fingers tightening around the ball. "There was an officer," he said quietly. "He thought we were causing trouble." Layla exhaled slowly, crossing her arms. "And what did he do?" "He just made us leave." Marcus forced a small shrug, but the way he avoided her gaze said more than words ever could. After a pause, he added, "It doesn't matter, Mom. It's over." But it wasn't. Upstairs, in the room adorned with old service plaques and medals, a suitcase sat open on the bed. Inside it were neatly folded shirts, documents in a leather folder, and a badge with a glinting gold outline. Chief Richard Hill was packing for a transfer that had taken months to finalize. He was coming home back to the same city he'd left decades ago when he'd been a young officer himself. His phone buzzed. A message from a former colleague read, "Congrats again, Chief Hill. Memphis needs strong leadership." He smiled faintly, looking at his reflection in the dresser mirror. To the public, he was stepping into one of the city's most demanding roles. To his family, he was finally returning for good. Downstairs, laughter flickered briefly, forced, uneasy. Layla tried to steer the evening back to normal by setting the table, but every clink of a dish reminded her of tension beneath the surface. She looked at her son again. "Promise me you'll stay calm, no matter what happens. People like us don't always get to make mistakes." Marcus met her eyes and nodded. He didn't need her to explain. He'd learned that lesson long before. Later that night, as the cicadas hummed outside, Marcus sat by his window, staring out into the faint glow of the streetlights. His phone buzzed repeatedly. Messages, tags, and notifications. A video was circulating online. Someone had caught the moment at the park on their phone. His name wasn't in the caption, but his face was clear. The clip wasn't violent. Just loud voices, tension, a flash of authority misused. But the image of him standing alone against that uniform spread faster than he could have imagined. He wanted to feel angry. He wanted to feel something. Instead, he just felt hollow, confused at how quickly an ordinary day had turned into a moment everyone wanted to talk about. Down the hall, Layla quietly opened a door. Richard stepped inside, suitcase in hand, his expression tired but proud. They hadn't lived under the same roof in years, work having kept him far away. When she told him everything, the park, the officer, the fear, something in his expression shifted. Quiet disbelief, then stillness. "Which precinct?" he asked softly. "East Memphis," she replied. He closed his eyes for a moment. That was his new post. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly over the horizon, a storm crawling in, slow but certain. Inside the house, the air was no less charged. Across town, in a small apartment bathed in the flicker of a television screen, Officer Daniel King sat slouched on his couch. The news played in the background, though he wasn't really listening. His radio rested on the coffee table beside an untouched dinner. He'd convinced himself he'd done nothing wrong. He'd followed protocol. That's what he kept repeating. Still, there was a knot in his stomach he couldn't untangle. Something about the look in that boy's eyes, calm, steady, defiant in silence, had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He turned up the sound to drown it out, but the voices from the report leaked through. "An incident at a local park today has sparked online debate about officer conduct." His fingers tightened around the remote. He switched off the TV. The room fell silent. And in that silence, two families unaware of how tightly their lives were about to intertwine, prepared for a dawn that would bring truths neither was ready to face. The next morning broke with a sharp clarity that only early autumn could bring. The skyline of Memphis glowed gold in the sunrise, the city still waking, the hum of traffic not yet at its peak. But inside the East Division precinct, the air was already thick with movement and energy. Officers waited, murmuring among themselves, straightening uniforms, glancing at the clock above the glass doors. Today was the introduction of their new commanding officer, Chief Richard Hill. The doors opened with quiet authority. Richard stepped inside, not hurriedly, not dramatically, but with the kind of calm presence that made people notice without meaning to. His steps were precise, his expression unreadable. The sunlight caught the gleam of his badge as he crossed the hallway lined with plaques and old photos of police history. He reached the conference room as conversations died down. Dozens of eyes followed his movement. Daniel King was among them, standing near the back, tapping a pen nervously against his hand. He didn't know yet who the new chief really was. Richard placed his folder on the table, scanned the faces in the room, and began. "Good morning. Some of you already know me by reputation. For those who don't, let me be clear, I am not here to watch things fall apart. I'm here because I believe this department can lead by example again. We don't serve power. We serve people. Every single person in this city deserves respect." His voice was steady, deep, but not loud. It filled the room like a signal. Authority through calmness, not through pressure. The officers exchanged careful looks. Some nodded quietly, others remained uncertain. Daniel shifted uneasily, pretending to take notes. There was something familiar in the chief's tone, something grounded and sure. But his thoughts wandered to the endless stream of messages that had filled his phone the night before. People forwarding him the same video from the park, others asking questions he didn't want to answer. He cleared his throat and forced himself to focus. Richard continued, "This department has seen difficult years, but trust can be rebuilt, not by speeches, not by slogans, but by action. Every officer here will be held to the same standard. That includes accountability for choices made in the field. If that makes anyone uncomfortable, you're free to request reassignment." A silence followed, dense and charged. King felt the weight of the words sit heavily in his chest. When the briefing ended, chatter returned quickly, officers discussing patrol rotations and schedules. Richard reviewed paperwork with his assistants, pausing mid-sentence when he saw one particular name, Officer Daniel King, East Patrol. His eyes lingered on the name tag longer than necessary, before he turned the page silently. Outside, the morning expanded into motion. Patrol cars rolled out one after another, the streets filled with life, children heading to school, vendors setting up, corner stores opening their metal gates. Meanwhile, at the Hill House, Marcus prepared for his day, trying not to think about the stares he'd gotten on the bus or the unread messages lighting up his phone. Every moment reminded him that his quiet anger from yesterday had turned into attention he didn't ask for. Yet part of him couldn't shake the question. Why should doing the right thing make people uncomfortable? Back at headquarters, Richard stood by the large window overlooking the city he once called home. His reflection looked older, harder. He'd seen years of bureaucracy, endless meetings about reform, words that rarely translated into real change. But this felt different. This was personal now, even if no one else knew it yet. A quiet knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Chief Hill, one of the officers from the East Sector is here to see you," said the assistant. "Officer King." Richard turned slightly, his expression still. "Send him in." Daniel stepped inside, his usual confidence dimmed. The chief gestured for him to sit. "Officer King," Richard began slowly, "I've reviewed some of your recent field reports." "Yes, sir," Daniel said, keeping his words measured. There was a long pause. The air between them thickened, but only one of them knew why. Richard leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about your patrol yesterday, the community park on Briarwood." Daniel's throat felt dry. "Routine check, sir. There were some kids playing. They matched a general complaint about—" Richard's interruption was quiet, but precise. "Which complaint?" Daniel hesitated, glancing toward the floor. "Noise disturbance. I advised them to leave the area." Richard nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "And did you find evidence of disturbance?" "No, sir. Just a group of teens." The silence that followed wasn't merely professional. It pulsed with unspoken knowledge. Richard stood then, moving toward the window. His voice softened, but carried an edge that cut through the quiet. Every complaint matters, but so does every moment of how we handle it. The way people remember an officer's tone can define their entire trust in this badge. Don't ever forget that. Daniel swallowed hard, unsure whether the comment was routine advice or something far heavier. He managed a faint, "Understood, sir." Richard gave a slow nod without turning. "Good, because from now on, I'll be watching very closely." Outside, thunder rolled again in the distance. The storm from the night before had not yet passed. Not over the city, and certainly not between these two men whose lives were now quietly and irreversibly entwined. The rain had started again, just like it had the night before. Soft, steady, with the promise of something inevitable. The sound of it tapping against the precinct windows created a rhythm that matched the tension slowly building in Chief Richard Hill's office. It was Tuesday afternoon. 3 days had passed since the first meeting with Officer Daniel King. Richard sat behind his desk, studying a file he'd requested from records. Not just any file, Daniel's complete service history, every citation, every complaint, every moment that mattered. But what drew his attention most was the latest report, fresh from the community relations desk. The park incident. His son's name wasn't mentioned in the official paperwork, but Richard knew. He'd seen the video. He'd watched his son stand quietly, calmly, while authority was misused right in front of him. A knock interrupted his thoughts. "Chief Hill," came the voice from the doorway. "Officer King is here for his follow-up meeting." Richard looked up slowly. "Send him in." Daniel entered the room looking more nervous than before. He'd spent the past 3 days replaying their last conversation, trying to understand the weight in his new chief's voice. Something about the way Richard had said, "I'll be watching very closely," felt personal, though he couldn't figure out why. "Please sit down," Richard said quietly. For a moment neither spoke. Rain continued against the windows. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Richard opened the file on his desk. "I've been reviewing your record, Daniel. Good marks in most areas, strong performance evaluations. But there are some patterns here." Daniel shifted in his chair. "Patterns, sir?" "Community complaints. Most were dismissed, but they tell a story." Richard's voice remained calm, steady. "Young people. Situations that could have been handled differently." The words hung in the air like smoke. Daniel felt his throat tighten. "Sir, I've always followed protocol." "Protocol." Richard repeated the word thoughtfully. "Tell me, what does protocol say about respect?" The question caught Daniel off guard. "Sir?" "Respect," Richard said again, leaning forward slightly. "When you approach a group of kids playing basketball, what does protocol tell you about showing them the same respect you'd show anyone else?" Daniel's mouth went dry. They were talking about the park. He was certain of it now. I treated them fairly, sir." "Fairly." Richard nodded once, as if considering the word. "Tell me about fair, Daniel. Is it fair to make assumptions? To approach young people with suspicion instead of service?" The questions weren't accusations, but they cut deeper than shouting would have. Daniel found himself looking at his hands. "I was responding to a complaint." "Were you?" Richard's tone didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "Or were you responding to something else entirely?" The silence returned. Heavier now. Daniel realized his hands were shaking slightly. Richard stood then, walking to the window. His reflection in the glass looked tired but determined. "I have a 16-year-old son, Daniel." The words were spoken quietly, almost to himself. "He's a good kid, respectful, works hard in school, helps his mother, stays out of trouble." Richard paused, still facing the window. "But sometimes I wonder what happens when good kids like him meet officers who've forgotten what service really means." Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. Richard turned around slowly. "That boy at the park, Marcus Hill. What did you see when you looked at him?" The name hit Daniel like electricity. Hill. The chief's name was Hill. "Sir, What did you see?" Richard's voice was still quiet, but now it carried the weight of something much larger. Daniel stared at him, understanding flooding over him like ice water. The calm teenager who hadn't backed down. The way he'd stood there, dignified even when being dismissed. The name on the reports he'd been trying not to think about. "He's your son," Daniel whispered. Richard nodded once. "He is." The rain seemed louder now, filling the space where words should have been. Daniel felt everything he thought he knew about his situation collapse around him. "What happens now?" Daniel asked, his voice barely audible. Richard walked back to his desk, picked up the file, and closed it with deliberate care. When he looked at Daniel again, his expression was unreadable. "Now," Richard said, "you have a choice to make." The storm outside grew stronger, rattling the windows. And in that small office, 2 men sat facing each other, one carrying the weight of fatherhood and authority, the other finally understanding that some moments change everything.